Okay, welcome. Today I wanted to offer some reflections about the different types of trauma, and I just want to begin with the first one, which is shock trauma. So, Gabor Mate, in his work, he talks about three different types of trauma. He talks about shock trauma, he talks about developmental trauma, that which happens when we're a child, and then attachment trauma, which is to do with our parents, the breaking of attachments. So I wanted to begin today with what is shock trauma, and then we'll talk in the next couple of weeks about developmental trauma and attachment trauma. So essentially, shock trauma, as Gabor Mate says in his work, he says the type of trauma that we usually think of when we think of the word trauma. And goes on to say that it is any event or an event which is so overwhelming that it shatters our whole sense of self and the world. And what he's talking about there, he gives an example of 9/11. So that is shock trauma. So most of us think, I haven't had that, so I'm not traumatized. What we'll go on to next week is, there's also developmental trauma and there's also attachment trauma. So, if we look at the overarching definition of trauma, as again Gabor Mate says, he says, any experience that's too much for us to process, digest, and integrate. So any experience that's too much for us to process, digest, and integrate. So I think sometimes we can say, I wasn't traumatized because I wasn't at 9/11, or, I was reading Joy Chavrin's work today, her new paper about boarding school syndrome, and she's saying that, that initial abandonment, and I would say for many that is a shock trauma. You've suddenly lost everything. You're aged 8. You see how big an 8-year-old is. Suddenly they've lost their mothers and fathers, they've lost their homes, they've lost their beds, they've lost their pets, their toys. Suddenly it's all gone. For me, that's a shock trauma. For some, it's not. Peter Levine, in his work, and I've mentioned this before, he says, perhaps the most important thing that I've learned about trauma is that people, especially children, can be overwhelmed by what we usually think of as common everyday events. Yeah. So I think this is important to know that, for some, leaving your parents like that might not be a shock. But I would suggest, it probably is, personally, if we were to listen to Gabor Mate or to hear, Peter Levine. Any experience that's too much for us to digest, process, or integrate. So, essentially that is shock trauma. And that's what we usually think of, and it's quite clear that, I've had this event happen. In Bessel Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about trauma, and he says, trauma by definition is unbearable and intolerable. Most rape victims, combat soldiers, and children who have been molested become so upset when they think about what they experienced that they try to push it out of their minds, trying to act as if nothing happened and move on. It takes tremendous energy to keep functioning while carrying the memory of terror and the shame of utter weakness and vulnerability. While we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that is devoted to ensuring our survival, deep below our rational brain, is not very good at denial. Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive, aggressive actions. these post-traumatic reactions feel incomprehensible and overwhelming. Feeling out of control, survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption. So I'd say when he's talking here, he's really talking about shock trauma on one level. Often these ideas of flashbacks that can happen with trauma. We get, we go back into that space of being a child. I had that in my 20s, a real flashback, and I was just in tears. I just remembered really early childhood of something really distressing happening to me, and I totally blocked it out. I think this is just important to note about trauma. Is what is it? Especially what is shock trauma. So just to finish again, so shock trauma, the type of trauma that we usually think of when we hear the word trauma. It is a single event that is so overwhelming that it shatters our whole sense of self and the world. So that is shock trauma. So if you got any questions, do recommend reading this book. So Gabor Mate's work, and the quote from Peter Levine comes from his book, Healing Trauma. I will talk further about the next couple of developmental trauma and attachment trauma in the next couple of weeks. Okay, blessings.